Good morning. Welcome to the U2 Conference 2021. It's a pleasure to welcome back Stuart Bailie. He was with us in 2018 when we were able to be there in person with him in Belfast, but now he's joining us, of course, by Zoom. But it's a pleasure to have you, and we're here to chat a little bit more about Achtung Baby as it's 30 years old. Stuart conducted a lovely interview earlier this week with Paul Muldoon, and we've shared that interview in our chat room. There's a link to that on YouTube. But right now it's just it's Stuart, and it's all Stuart, and we're so happy to have you with us to continue that conversation a little bit. And I wonder how you're doing with the album, and if you've heard it lately, to help you get into the mood to celebrate its 30th anniversary.
I had a listen, Scott, last week in preparation for the conversation with Paul Muldoon. It's one of those records that's sort of hardwired into my brain. You know, it's like London Calling by The Clash. It's almost like I don't need to hear it anymore. But having said that, it's very evocative. It takes you to an interesting time in global history. And also this kind of moment when the band made quite a bold swing. It reminds me, at the time I was working at New Musical Express, which is kind of, I guess, the equivalent of Spin or Rolling Stone magazine. It was based in London. It was the biggest selling UK music publication. And it was weekly, so you were literally just, things were moving all the time, and I kind of remember waiting for to see what U2 were going to do, and then this. I think it's fair to say that there were quite a lot of people who were skeptical about U2 in the offices of the NME, and then this thing arrived, and then there was quite a lot of fierce debate. Was it any good? Was it derivative? Was it phony? You know, and everybody had their own corner. I thought by leading with the track "The Fly" as the first single was an act of fantastic audacity. You know, it was kind of, wow, okay, here's a song that's fractured and abstract and as far away from a lot of the stuff they were doing previously as you can get. And I'm just talking here, Scott, so tell me when to shut up if you want. But it was, if you go back to in that time capsule to what was happening in London around 1990, 1991, there was a lot of rock music, alternative rock music had gone very dance. Everybody had gone into these syncopated shuffles. And a lot of that had come through the city of Manchester. So it was bands like the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays. And also pop music was using a lot of sampling. So you had Jesus Jones and EMF and people like that. And then you had Acid House. And you know, there was a new chemical in town, which was MDMA. And that was affecting how creative people were. Even if you didn't accept it, it sort of soaked into the zeitgeist. So it was an incredibly exciting time. And I think if U2 had to put out another, you know, trad rock album, people would have just said, sorry, we're not interested. But I think consciously or unconsciously, they became part of the conversation and became a very pertinent part of the conversation, I think. So it was very exciting.
Yeah. Well, for our viewers who just sort of showed up, we're talking with Stuart Bailie, and as you just were mentioning, you've been on the scene and you've been on many music and culture scenes for quite a time now, and you're very aware of the music coming out of the Dublin scene and the UK in the 80s, and it sounds like you expected maybe something different from U2. Were you surprised yourself when Achtung Baby showed up?
Yeah, very much so. I had been at that gig on New Year's Eve, 1989, at the Point Depot in Dublin, right. And they had BB King in support, and it was the sort of the rattle and hum experience, and it was exhilarating. And you know, that's maybe when I'm older, it's less of an issue, but it felt like the turn of that decade was an anxious one. You needed to be in good company. So there's a lot of people that I know had gone down to Dublin and were part of that experience. And, we heard the Bono speech about, going away to dream it all up again. And that was kind of the throwdown. And there had been a few things after that, which you'll know about. They did that Night and Day track for the Red Hot and Blue, I think, album, the AIDS charity, which was a Cole Porter song, I think. And I think they had been working with the dance producer Youth with that. And I think he had been encouraging them to take a few swerves. And I think there had even been a few remixes around the time of Rattle and Hum. They had Little Richard in to be a preacher on, I think it was, they did a remix of Love Comes to Town and stuff. So that, there were kind of tremors coming down the Mojo line that there was going to be something interesting. And May 1990, there was an advertisement in the UK music press to say, don't be buying these bootleg albums that are starting to surface. And of course, everybody at the Enemy went, we have to hear those bootleg albums. And I remember going around Kensington Market in London, where you could buy almost any bootleg in the world, and the fear in the vendor's eyes when you said, have you got the U2 one? It was just like, because, I think at that stage they had all of the major crime fighting agencies around the world were keeping an eye on this. But we got one, we got the Silver and Gold albums through a friend of a friend. And I think we were only allowed a loan of them for a day or a night. And I remember listening to them, and it was tracks like Salome and stuff like that on them in a very rough state. But you could hear them trying to reach for something. And we reviewed them, of course. We wrote a news story about it. And so that, week by week, we there was almost a kind of a growing, and people, the cynics would say there's always a story about a U2 leak just before the album comes out, and does someone almost allow that to happen because it's good PR? And that would be a very cynical thing to say, but it certainly piqued a lot of people's interest. And then I think they turned up at some Irish awards show and kind of were slightly misbehaving, and it was interesting. So it came out, and as I say, it was a thrilling time generally for music. So it wasn't as if everybody stopped and went, well, this is it, this is the new thing. But I think there was generally a consensus that it was a good thing. And I just thought the lyrics of The Fly were almost more interesting than the music. I just thought what he was trying to do and how he was taking it off into this, the devil's advocate kind of thing. I thought it was great. And, thinking of Lord of the Flies and how that connected with their early career and stuff. So that it wasn't as if it was a complete flash in the pan.
Well, I recall reading one of your early, one of the reviews of the album, and when you were able to legitimately listen to it and then write about it, I believe you were one of the first, I think, writers to have an interview with Bono where he indicated that he had this idea of innocence and experience in his in his worldview for creating this album and going somewhere different. And that, as we know, the album itself is quite a darker turn and quite a more mysterious and kind of seedy, sort of experience from where perhaps the earlier work was, especially maybe on the Lovetown tour. Could you talk a little bit about, that the sense there of darkness and mystery, and The Fly seems to be a great segue into that.
Well, that idea, a lot of people are probably across William Blake, but he was an 18th century poet, engraver, but he was a kind of a mystic, and he talked to angels in the trees in Peckham Rye, and dead relatives spoke to him, and he painted these incredible visionary images, and the song, which is known as Jerusalem, is kind of one of his most famous works. But he had this set of songs of innocence and experience. And the first part was these beautiful visions of roses and love and children. And then the second part of it was the Industrial Revolution, disease, capitalism, and how all these beautiful, it was almost like partner songs. So you know, oh Rose, thou art sick, and you had the worm was in the rose, and all of these things that had happened that had corrupted innocence. And you know, I think it transpired that Bono was across a lot of that. And then obviously the two albums, The Innocence and Experience, kind of made that more explicit later on. So I think there was a strange thing going on the tour around 91 and later, maybe even later than that. And occasionally, I'll not ascribe this to one single person, but they use the term squeakies quite a lot. And that would be conservative Christians. You know, they would, someone in the party would say, is so-and-so a squeaky? And I was going, what does that mean? You know, and I think that comes from squeaky clean. The idea that something is, someone is a little bit too virtuous for, you know, the virtuousness might be a little bit overshiny. And I think Achtung Baby was almost the opposite of that. It was like, you know, what's the opposite of squeaky? I don't know, but it's slidey or something, you know. But it was, you know, to really understand sin and to understand adult life and to understand the fall and to let's drop into the head of Judas for a moment and see what he did for 30 pieces of silver and how he coped with it afterwards. And for any artist that is interesting, you know, and you know, Milton's Paradise Lost, the most fascinating character in the book is the devil, you know, because he's got all his angst and his, you know, he's been chucked out of heaven and he's full of revenge and he's good at what he does, and you know. So for you two to take a steer into that Twilight Zone, I thought was amazing, and I listened to the record compulsively, and you know, Until the End of the World and stuff like that. You think those are great pieces of work. And I think the song One was a bit of a sleeper. I don't know how many people at the time really went, that's the most amazing thing. And even on the subsequent tour, I remember Paul McGuinness, the manager, going, yeah, we're going to keep One for the third or fourth single or whatever, you know. And I think he kind of knew it was going to do well, but I don't think everyone was fully aware that was the one that was going to reside, you know, in people's folk memory, and it was going to say a lot about the career of U2. But I think you know, by the time the record, it took a lot of time to digest. It wasn't an overnight, this is amazing, and yeah, but once you got to grips with it, I remember by Christmas thinking, wow. And it was, I remember also, you know, REM, Losing My Religion was around that time as well. And there was some great music by PJ Harvey and other people, and Kurt Cobain. And there was a kind of a tone of despair. You know, there was a lot of bad news about, a lot of musicians were finding it hard to function. And I think Achtung Baby almost put a little bit of that into the atmosphere as well.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned One as a sleeper, and it 30 years later now, here we are at this moment where it feels, I think, to many U2 fans, and you've probably observed this yourself, that U2 now is really showcasing that song as the story or as the narrative for, you know, what kept the band together almost, and discovering and finding that song. And, you know, now it some of those other tracks, of course, that early on were the most shocking and kind of delightful and dark and, you know, dancey, have kind of, maybe, I don't know if the band's trying to have them take a, you know, second seat to One now, but it seems like that's the song that's now, here we are 30 years later, that perhaps will be the one that lives on, you know, forever. But how do you feel about those tracks now, you know, at this point? Is One the definitive track, or would you argue for The Fly still?
Well, I think One is your get out of jail card. You know, I think if your concert's going badly wrong, or you're in a difficult moment, or you're in a diplomatic moment in a semi-political kind of scenario, that's the song you play. You know, and you know, I'm sure you've analysed it all to death, but it means a lot for different places. I was involved in the Yes concert for the referendum on the peace process in Northern Ireland in 1998, and that was suddenly, when you drop that song into that scenario, it's kind of like, okay, you know, we don't. That's one less speech we need to have now, because that says so much in a 3-minute pop song. So it is, and you know, and I think sometimes you might get a little bit bored, or it might lose its aura, and that's okay. You know, we're you know, a band like the Beatles, different albums resonate over different eras. You know, I remember in 1991 with the dance era, a lot of people were listening to Revolver because of Ringo's drumming and because of the kind of slightly psychedelic thing that we're doing. And obviously at the moment we're listening to Let It Be and trying to work out what's going on. So I think different U2 albums come in and out of focus. And obviously rightly Achtung, but you know, the Joshua Tree was rightly represented to the world. And I think the second side of the Joshua Tree, they made a good case for, you know, you might have missed some of these songs, you know, and have a listen to you know, the Spring Hill, you know, and listen to it fresh. So I think The Fly stands up. I think one is amazing. I think Until the End of the World is just a brilliant lyric. And I'm just, excuse me, I'm just going to have a wee look now at some of the stuff. But Acrobat is a great lyric.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and it took them quite a while to bring that back, you know, into the set list. And yeah.
And I think Zoo Station is a great opener. You know, it's literally, we're going to pitch you into this super sensory experience, you know, and this idea of the East Berliners, whether they're getting trains or cars, or they're driving their Trabant until it collapses, and they're getting into the West, and they're experiencing capitalism and the commercial overload and the neon lights. And obviously that set them up perfectly for the tour, because that was almost like, right, okay, we're going to really fry your retinas with this. So I think it was a well sequenced record. I think some of, you know, going back to the, you know, bands like Happy Mondays, they had a great song called Lazy Itis. And a lot of those songs, and people started to dress more loosely because they were going to clubs and they were dancing. And we, and in the NME, we called it baggy music because it was getting away from tight fitting clothes. And you compare Lazy Itis by Happy Mondays to Trying to Throw Your Arms Around the World, and you can hear that beat, that sloping beat, you know. So some of those songs are maybe less, you know, musically anyway, you're kind of going, okay, it was of its time, you know, but you know, like I say, Zoo Station or One or The Fly or Until the End of the World, I think they really stand out.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, in a few minutes, maybe if we could have some questions from the room, that'd be wonderful. Let me just remind everybody that there is a YouTube interview out there now. We've put that link in the chat session, but earlier in the week, Paul Muldoon and Stuart had a conversation. The title of that was Eclipsed by the Moon, U2, Achtung Baby, and Celtic Twilights. I recommend that highly. It was such a pleasure to listen to that earlier. Stuart, what did you take away from that interview? What struck you with what Paul had to say and how that went?
I think one of the things that impacted on me, I think it was the second date of the Zoo TV tour in Miami, and I met these two individuals who I think they were teenagers, they regarded themselves as kind of pagans. And they were kind of wearing cloaks and things. And I was a kind of a bit of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer kind of a vibe. And I think the girl called herself Persephone or something like that. Mm-hmm. But they were convinced that Achtung Baby was a call to the pagan underworld, you know, to relate to this record. And I kind of laughed at it at the time. And then you kind of think, well, the importance of the moon, yeah, and the whole lunar energy that comes out of that record, and the darkness and the eclipse. And that's something that I think about quite a lot. And it was later that I read The White Goddess by Robert Graves, which is a slightly mad thing about Celticism and the matriarchy and old languages that have sort of been obliterated, but they somehow are in the back of the poetic mind. And I kind of brought that into the conversation with Paul Muldoon, and he kind of, took the ball and ran with it, and that was right. And his idea, the moon and the muse, and he furthered that, which is something that's going to take me years to understand. But he thinks there's a connection between the muse and the DNA, which is kind of telling you to procreate and to move the species onwards, and that's almost part of the poetic drive. And you kind of go, okay, I've not heard of that before, but it fits and it's a great riff. So I enjoyed that part of the conversation, mostly because it was so far out of my own comfort zone or my own line of thinking. But I think Bono explicitly or intuitively knew that he was going into that area, that zone. I think semi consciously knew where he was going with that.
Right. No, I think it's sort of a insightful moment there to pick up on the role of the moon in the catalog and the works of U2. It's certainly been there. I remember there's a scene in the little film they made for the making of The Unforgettable Fire. I don't know if you recall that film, but I think it's Brian Eno who asked them to sort of step outside and look up at the sky, and they're all looking, I think, up at the moon at that moment, and that would have been, early in their sort of development as a band. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that point up with Paul, and that was certainly it's a good moment there in the interview. Who's out there now? Who would like to ask a question? We could probably just have you unmute yourself and speak up. We don't really have too many in the room, so we could kind of take turns that way. But would somebody like to offer a comment or ask a question for Stuart? I see Angela has raised her Zoom hand. Hi, Angela.
Let me see if okay, that's how I lower my Zoom hand as well. So Stuart, you mentioned the turn from 1980 to 1990, to 1980s to 1990s as a moment where people felt a little unsure of themselves, that there was a bit of something in the air that people had some angst about that. Can you speak more to that?
It's been quite a long time ago. I obviously, there was an Irish band called That Petrol Emotion, and their album was called End of the Millennium Psychosis Blues. And this idea that the closer we got to the end of the century, the more neurotic people were getting, and the more they felt they were going to the edge of a cliff, and going, well, where's the future? And I think 1989 New Year's Eve was when that became amplified. It was like, well, we're on the last lap now of this thing, and the Berlin Wall and various other cataclysmic things were happening, both exciting and frightening. And I think the natural instinct is for people to kind of come together, and certainly later in the decade, we had this thing called Britpop, which was Blur and Oasis, and they almost pretended that it was 1966 again, and it was the Beatles and the Stones, and I think there was a lot of nostalgia. It was almost forced nostalgia, but everybody wanted things that were kind of comfortable, and But I think we just knew we were on this bridge around that time, and I remember thinking, I have to be at the point. I have to be with music people, and I have to be in a good town, and I have to be able to hug people as we go into that scary decade. So you're throwing that question at me, and I haven't thought it through, but I just know it was very much in my bones rather than something that I'd thought through. And then by the, the end of the next decade, we were in the UK, at least, it was the millennium bug. The computers were all going to explode and we were all going to melt down. And that was horrendous. Of course, none of that happened. Computer companies made a lot of money out of our fear. But my child had to be born on the 27th of December to be out of the hospital before the computers exploded, so but that was a different decade. But I just remember feeling we're going into something new, and it's a bit exciting, but it's a worry.
Thank you.
Stuart, there's a question here. I'd just like to read it out.
Yeah,
from Johnny. He brings up the Belfast concerts again, and the mention that you two gave to Terry Hooley from the stage, and he just was wondering if there's a connection that you know of between the 1970s punk scene with Terry and you two.
Well, Belfast had an amazing punk rock scene, and it was largely grassroots. It came from nowhere, and Belfast in 1975 at the Miami show band Killings. There's an amazing documentary on Netflix. You can check it out, and it was, basically a band of entertainers were machine gunned near the Irish border, the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So punk was, the context of punk in Northern Ireland was kind of, Stiff Little Fingers had a song called Alternative Ulster. So it was almost like we have to find a new model for young people because we can't be sectarian for the rest of our lives. And Terry Hooley ran a record shop on Great Victoria Street, which was near the Europa Hotel, which was the most bombed hotel in the world at that stage. I think the Sarajevo Hilton has that accolade now. So Terry's shop was a place that was routinely bombed, And the music that came out was so exciting. And this is a guy who was anti-business, so he would just press up 1,000 records, chuck them out, and then move on to the next thing. Wouldn't do tax returns, none of that. But he put out Teenage Kicks by the Undertones. He put out Big Time by Rudy, and you two were very much in awe of what was happening in Belfast. And Bono had relatives in the north, and obviously he was of mixed Protestant and Catholic stock, and so Belfast was the place to be, and they had those records. And I remember Adam Clayton saying, if you speed up with or without you, it sounds like Alternative Ulster, and I don't know how unlikely that is, but I think what you two had to, and Dublin had the Radiators, it had the Boomtown Rats and stuff, but it just wasn't as fiery and as succinct. But what you two did, and a few of their peers with the Virgin Prunes and people, is they gravitated towards post-punk, which was the way out of punk rock. So I remember there was a famous gig, and my mind's slightly blank now, but it had the Mekons, and it was supposed to be John Lydon, and it was supposed to be various other people, and a load of Belfast punk bands came down, and you two played. And I think there was an arrogance about the Belfast punks. They're going, we'll show these Dubliners what it's about. And I think in hindsight, it was actually Dublin has gone post-punk, and you've been left in a punk place, which is, Belfast can be quite a conservative place in some way. And I think that was almost the moment where Dublin and Belfast swapped roles, and Dublin became a much more important city for music, and Belfast had some good music after that, but it kind of didn't jump to the opportunities that was coming from Manchester and Glasgow and Dublin, and new tones out of the guitar, not necessarily Chuck Berry riffs and rock and roll. So that was the moment, really. Somebody can tell me the name of that venue again. It wasn't the TV station, but it was something like that anyway.
Thank you. Very good. Diane Pennington has her Zoom hand raised. Hi, Diane. Go ahead.
So, Stuart, thank you very much for all this and for the interview. I watched it early this morning. It was much better than watching the news, which is what I normally watch in the morning. So,
Right,
every
yeah.
morning now it's like, I can't believe the news today every single morning, right? But I got your book, and just to make others jealous, I got your autograph in it. Back
Oh, very good.
so thank you for this. I really enjoyed it. And it, I was thinking about this, like, because of, when you talked in 2018 and we were talking about pop and the Good Friday Agreement and all of that, things that were historically relevant at the time. But then it makes me think about Achtung Baby, because we always think of Achtung Baby as being about Europe and the future of Europe. And it was recorded in Berlin. And do you think that they were, do you think there was anything about the Troubles that were in their thoughts at the time, or was it more of a focus on the continent? Or like, how does it, because you don't hear any of that. It's like they came back to it in pop, and they were obviously doing it before, but where does Achtung Baby fit in the sort of the Irish, Northern Irish setting at that time?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I remember on Rattlin' Hum, there was tracks like Van Diemen's Land, where it was almost like, here's an Irish Republican being deported to the Southern Hemisphere for what he believes in. And obviously war was war in the north of Ireland was a big part of the spectacle and the significance of the white flag and Sunday Bloody Sunday. And people sometimes knock the North because it's almost like you're so needy. You always need to be part of the story. You need to be, what about our conflict? And it's like, well, it's not always your conflict. What about Sarajevo? What about, what about what's happening with Sandinistas and what's happening in Latin America? So I think we weren't really part of the menu for that. I think Berlin was where it was happening in a lot of ways. It was just this incredible fault line. And all of a sudden it felt like the badness of post-war was coming down and people were walking through the holes in the walls. And I think the next time we got a name check, and again, other people will know more about this than I, but I remember when the song Stay, which was later, and Belfast gets a shout out, There's always that bit on the tour, the concert where we can't say shout out Belfast. So I think we were kind of not blatantly part of that story, and that's all right, around this time it was, and there was a little while where like Sinn Féin tried to make U2 part of their project, or Gerry Adams had a U2 poster in his office and stuff, and Bono always avoided that connection. It was like, no, we're not partisan in that way, and we're totally anti armed resistance in that extent. And people at the NME would go, okay, you're bigging up Amnesty International on your tour. What about what's happening in Castlereagh police station in East Belfast, where they're saying they're breaking the Geneva Convention and using white noise to kind of break down prisoners and making them stand against the wall or put sacks over their head. So there were people that were saying, look, it's well and good, you saying here's what's happening in Latin America, but what about what's happening in Belfast? So certainly the critics of U2 around this time were saying, you're leaving that place alone, aren't you? And I think they swung that attention back round, and obviously were very present for the referendum on the Good Friday Agreement, and that's when it really impacted. And as we had the conversation before, it helped to swing the vote, which was amazing. So I think it was the dark heart of Europe we were at that point, and as you all know, the part of Hansa. Didn't it have a connection to the Gestapo or the SS or something like that? There was all these dark reverberations going on where they were recording. I'm just talking off the top of my hat, by the way. So nobody expect me to be a great authority on anything. So
I think Scott was trying to respond, but he was muted.
Sorry?
Scott was muted. I think he was trying to respond.
Okay.
Oh, no. I was just saying, who has another question? But thank you. So you talking off the top of your head is our pleasure, Stuart.
Okay, right.
No problem. And we have time for maybe another question or two, and then we'll need to wrap it up. Looks like, yeah,
Hey,
that would
Scott,
be
it's
great.
great.
Hi,
Great.
Greg.
Hey,
You're on.
thank you. Stuart, could you talk a little bit about So Cruel? I mean, that song is I mean, it's haunting, and it doesn't seem like it gets enough play. It's kind of tucked in there in the album. Just maybe say a word about that.
She wears my love like a see-through dress. Is not the line in it? Uh, there's a few things there. I think one of the working titles for the album was Adam, wasn't it? So it was, you know, the first album was called Boy, and then this one was Adam, and obviously the bass player was Adam, and they almost had a picture of him at full frontal nude on the cover until someone persuaded him not to do that. But obviously Adam being Adam in the Garden of Eden as well, and temptation and the fall. So it's an adult record, and you know, the first big U2 number one, I think, was Desire of Rattle & Hum, and you're kind of thinking, you're singing about sex, but it doesn't sound that convincing. You know, it sounded like a class exercise, write a song about sex, and whereas I think this record is about sort of weird, not weird sex. That's a wrong way to say it, but about the nuances and the strangeness of adult love and relationships, and almost that bit where you realize it's not necessarily going to be happy ever after. That's not how the adult experience always pans out. And you know, Edge had been having his divorce, and the band had been fractured, and it was kind of the whole record is that, but the foundations are all a bit cracked and crumbling. And he had written Mystery Girl for Roy Orbison for the black and white, around that time of the black and white evening, and Roy Orbison, the emperor of heartbreak, you know, and that sobbing, trembling voice that apparently was influenced by the plains of Texas and the radio stations and the radio waves, and you know, when he was listening to music, it had a strange resonance. And I think for So Cruel, there's a Roy Orbison is definitely there, that the desolation of love. There's a bit of Scott Walker there, again, a man who sang about the magisterial heartbreak that you could sing in a song, and Scott Walker got it from Frank Sinatra. And also around that time, Bono's singing about, he's talking about this notion of the bel canto singer, about the adult singer who doesn't necessarily have all of that high notes or all of the, but he's in command of his voice and his art. And I think So Cruel is one of those songs that he sort of pulls out of the hat, and he's going, it's like the lounge singer, but you know, you will cry into your Guinness as you're listening to it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think as a singer, he really explored parts of his voice on this record, which, you know, when you move on to Miss Sarajevo and things like that, is you know, and his father being an opera fan, there's a whole other layer of what he learns to do with his voice on this record.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I left a few links in the chat area to some more information about Stuart's recent work. Diane mentioned Stuart's book, Trouble Songs, and I put an interview there about the book itself, and then a link to the book. And also, you have a sort of a new project. I understand it's a bit of a family project called Dig With It, the magazine. Would you like to say a few words about what you're working on lately?
Yeah, well, the Trouble Songs book came out in 2018. It came out on the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and I had a little bit of help from the British Council. They wanted something to kind of relate to that moment, and they had a big conference in Belfast, and I think all the delegates got a book, and it was written in a flurry, and it was an independent publication, and it seems to do quite well. It continues to sell. It sells from my kitchen table. So I just sit there with jiffy bags and sticky tape and send it out to the world. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but hopefully there's going to be a film documentary in the next couple of years. These things have a habit of crashing when your hopes are high, but so that's been quite a big part of my life, and a lovely thing, because at the time you were going, nobody cares about this, and every 6 months or so there's a little wave of interest again, or somebody discovers it. I wrote a book last year during lockdown called 75 Van Songs, when I picked my favorite 75 Van songs and put them in alphabetical order. There was no favorites, and then just wrote about them, mostly from the perspective of East Belfast. I live near Cypress Avenue, which is immortalized in a famous Van Morrison song, and he writes about Orangefield and Hindford Street, and my nocturnal walks during lockdown, I walked the streets of Van Morrison. And then I also did, my daughter's a graphic designer. She's just graduated, and we do a magazine called Dig With It. And old school, there is a blog, but it's mostly as a magazine. And again, it's sort of slow culture. It's kind of like, it takes time and effort. It's on really attractive paper. We try and do about 90% of our own images. We do long form interviews. And, it's the era when I grew up reading New Musical Express, Cream, Old Rolling Stone, and, stuff that had tried to have a bit of substance and tried to reflect counterculture. And the title is from a Seamus Heaney poem called Digging, where his father had a spade, Seamus Heaney has a pen, and at the end of the poem is, I'll dig with it, and that's the kind of the ethos of it all, really.
Great. Yeah, no, it is a wonderful journal. I can attest to the paper is delightful, and the contents are too. It ships to the United States, and you can order it from digwithit.com. I happen to order, of course, the issue that had the interview you had with Inhaler.
Yes.
Yeah, so you've really sort of been there through all the years that you were back on the sort of shuttle express air flights, I understand, back in the early 90s with you two, going back and forth, and then more recently you were sitting down with Inhaler talking about what they're up to now. So you've certainly seen it all, Stuart.
Well, I've had some great times, and I moved to London in '85 to be a journalist after being a kind of a bad punk bass player, and I remember going to Self-Aid in Dublin in 1980. Was that 86? It was after Live Aid anyway. So and that, and that's when U2 had gone from the War album. They started playing Eddie Cochran songs, and they did a version of Maggie's Farm that night. And that's, to be honest, that's when I sort of went, okay, because I as a punk fan and a Clash fan, the early U2 didn't really grab me. And bands like Echo and the Bunnymen and Susie and the Banshees and the Skids, they and Joy Division were kind of front of the pack in terms of post-punk, and U2 were sort of not quite at the front. And then obviously they overtook all of those artists. But Self-Aid was Van Morrison, the Chieftains, Clannad, Gary Moore, Elvis Costello, the Pogues. So it was almost that moment you realize you're part of this family. Haven't we done quite well for a little island, a little messed up island? And I remember almost everyone being at their best that night, and they finished with Whiskey in the Jar. We just lost Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy, and it became a bit of a wake and a requiem for him as well. And then that was me. I was just traveling and writing, and when you got a chance, you're on a plane and you're hanging with people, and because you were enemy, you were kind of indulged. You were given time, whereas now nobody's given time. Everything is quick and cheerful, and you move on to the next thing. So I was lucky to participate in an interesting era, and I think I'm going to reflect more early next year on what the Zoo TV tours and all of that was about, because that's almost another journey, and what Willie Williams and the band were doing and conceptualizing that record. Because again, you don't normally, certainly in 1991, you don't put out an album and then not tour it. That way, it just seems so mad. You put out a left field record,
Yeah.
you put out an album, and then you don't tour it. And you're kind of going, that's insane. And then almost the next year, then you go, right, they're playing this tour. I've no idea what it's going to look like or feel like, but I've got to be there. And the next thing, the Trabants are going up, and the glitter bands, the glitter balls are there, and the Philips TV screens are igniting, and so that was, you know, rather than a poor Xerox of the album, they just took it to another amazing dimension. That's a whole other story, nearly.
It sure is. It sure is, and we like to. Yeah, check in with you next year for that story.
Yeah, well, we'll
Yeah.
see. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we all need to digest a bit of that too. But that was amazing, and I've never seen a band take so many chances with big audiences, with a lot of tech, but literally seat of the pants at the same time. You know, that whole dynamic of spontaneity, but the machinery there and the audience there. And yet, you know, and I think as the tour went on, it got a little bit more settled. But at the start of that tour was like, what is this? You know, and I don't think they even knew, and that was exhilarating.
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we thank you so much, but we appreciate the time we've had with you, Stuart.
Thank you,
please,
Scott.
Yeah. Check out Stuart Bailie's work. Please visit digwithit.com and look up 75 songs and trouble songs, and you take good care of yourself, Stuart. Be well.
Lovely, Scott. Thank you very much.
Again.
Cheers, everyone.
Follow